Hi all, it's Teresa in Gemma's house. Well, it's time to make another crazy scrap quilt. I made this one a few years ago and I really liked the way it turned out. And it was so much fun to make. Well, I gave that one to a family member, so I'd like to make another one. And this is such a great use of all the fabric scraps that I've been collecting, and it's way better than just storing those scraps, or worse yet, throwing them away. So if you've made a crazy scrap quilt of your own and have some tips, please leave them in the comments below. Or if you have any questions about the way I explained how I was making this one, please leave me a comment and I'll be sure to get back to you. Okay, so I'm just going to show you this first part in fast motion. I hope this is not annoying for you to watch it in fast motion. But what I'm doing is I'm just using all small pieces and sewing them onto the sides, kind of going around and around in a circle. And I'm trying to use pieces that will not be the same as the pieces that are beside them. Once I get to a certain size, I then take it over to the iron and iron it all flat. I'm not that concerned about cutting off the thick seams that are on the back unless they are very big pieces, and then I will usually cut some of the seams in the back so they don't get too bunchy, too thick. And I find that using all cotton fabrics, that even if it's rippling a little bit, once I start ironing it out, it flattens really nicely with a nice hot steam iron. Okay, so now that I got to this point, what I'm going to do is sew a couple separate scrap pieces together so that I have a nice variety to sew onto these long sides, because otherwise I'll just have long strips here and it won't be that interesting. Okay, so I was trying to sew some pieces in a long strip so that I could attach it to this long side, but the piece I started making became a little more rectangular instead of long, so I'm going to attach it on this side instead. Because the colors all work well, there aren't any fabrics that are similar to each other that will be sitting side by side. Okay, so now I have to do some strategizing. I have a couple long sides, and I don't want to put long strips of fabric along these. I want to have smaller pieces. So I'm going to have to use smaller pieces of fabric to make a kind of a triangle shape for this area here, and then some that are long strips made up of smaller pieces to fill in these areas. Okay, so here's where I am at now. Before, I had awkward angles on the edges, and what I did is I sewed a lot of smaller pieces together to make shapes to sew onto those edges. Then I cut some straight lines all the way around. And now I'll continue to make strips made out of a lot of smaller pieces so that I have a nice variety of fabrics. And then I'll sew those strips along these edges. So eventually I'll be able to square this up to be either a square or a rectangle, whatever I decide. And I'm liking it. And it's a really good use of all my scraps. Okay, so here's where I'm at now. I sewed all these little pieces to make this piece to attach onto this piece. And what I'm going to do is cut straight lines on both of these so I can flip this one over and sew it on. Okay, so that worked really well. And now I can cut this straight across and then add a strip of pieced fabrics along there. So I start out with a piece of fabric that I like, and then I just start adding on other pieces around it, and I just keep going around and around and adding on to the sides until I get to a shape that I can add on to the existing quilt. And I just finger press it to keep it relatively flat. And once it gets a certain size that it starts to get more ripply, I will iron it all flat then. And I usually cut off those bigger pieces so that I can give myself straight lines to add on new pieces of fabric. So here I'm just going to maintain this straight line here. So I'll cut it off. Instead of putting one fabric along this whole side, I'm going to sew a couple pieces of different fabrics together to make a long strip to put on this side and onto these other sides too. Okay, I think this piece is ready to iron, and I can attach it to this long piece. And see what I mean? All these smaller pieces sewn together in a strip are way more interesting than if I had put one long piece of fabric here. So you'll probably get to a place where you have a piece like this that has an uneven side. I would just take a longer piece of fabric and just lay it over top of that and sew, and that will even out that edge and give you a more rectangular piece. I'll just start piecing a couple more fabrics together and sew these on. Okay, so I got to this size and I needed to fill in this corner here, so I just sewed on this piece of fabric, and I will straighten up this shape to have some nice long edges. Okay, so I want to piece fabrics to make a piece to fill in here and also at the top here. They'll both be long triangular pieces. I'll sew this one onto this one. So one thing to watch out for is when you're sewing two pieces together and you want a certain shape, lay the fabrics right side up beside each other, and when you figure out that it will work, just flip the one piece over onto the other piece, lining up the edges. This angle might confuse you, but once it's sewn and it lays out flat, it will work like you originally intended. Just something to watch out for. Here's another example. I want to add this piece onto here. So without moving this piece up or down, I'm just going to flip it carefully onto the other piece and then sew it and then iron it flat. Okay, I just have to continue with a couple more pieces here. Okay, so now I have a piece big enough to fill in this space. So I'll sew this piece onto this piece, and first I'm going to cut a straight line. And flip this over onto here without moving it up or down. Okay, so that worked out well. I'll sew this piece onto this piece here, and then I can cut this straight across and continue building on here and up here. Okay, so here's a 15-inch high by 6-foot long crazy scrap quilt. It's going to be the center of a quilt for a couch cushion. And I only have this many scraps left out of these color combinations. Okay, I just went through my blue, green, blacks, grays, scraps that I have. And another tip, when you're cutting your scraps up, make sure to have a lot of different shapes. Nice long strips, shorter strips, some rectangles, squares, and triangles really come in handy too. Some odd-shaped pieces are fine to have because you can border them on all sides and then start going around and around. Okay, so I'm finished with the quilt, and I still have all these blue scraps that I think I will piece together to make matching pillow covers for the quilt. Okay, so here's my crazy scrap quilt that I finished so far. I haven't quilted it yet. I'm going to do free motion quilting on this, and I'll have to work on that later on. And if you haven't seen that video I made, I have a video on free motion quilting on my Baby Lock Jazz 2 sewing machine. And I will post it at the end of this video in case you're interested in watching that. So what I ended up doing with the blue scraps was I pieced together a lot of little fabrics to make a 12-inch high piece that ran the length of the quilt. And then I cut it into 4-inch strips so I could border it all the way around. And I used other pieces of blue fabric that I had in my scrap pile. These are pieces from old jeans of mine to border this center section. And to get to the width and length that I wanted, I also used these strips from remnant fabrics that I had to add a little pop of color in there. So the finished size on this is 32 inches high by 88 inches wide. And I think this will work well as a quilt to lay on the couch cushion to keep it clean from the dogs. What I'm planning to do now in the quilting process is I'll use a blanket that I haven't been using as the batting in the middle. And then for the backing, I have remnants of flannel fabric, and I'll piece those together for the backing. So I really like the way it turned out. And I would really love to hear your comments if you have any other suggestions about crazy scrap quilting. Okay, so I hope this video gave you some good ideas to use, and maybe will help whittle down that fabric scrap collection that you have. And if you like this video, can I ask you to please give it a thumbs up? That helps this video reach more viewers. So thanks for watching. Bye-bye.